It's my privilege to now welcome to the truth Dr. Tevi Troy. He is a presidential historian, having served in George W. Bush's White House. He is a graduate of Cornell and has a PhD in American Civilization from the University of Texas, Austin, and he studied at the London School of Economics as well. He has written a new book called The Power and the Money. I can't think of a more apropos topic to talk about in this particular point in time. Welcome to the truth, Dr. Troy. Can I call you Tevi?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, John.
My pleasure. So, what inspired you to write the book? And you must be clairvoyant to have come up with that title and published it at this point in our nation's history.
Well, I've written 5 books on presidential history. With each book, I try and write something about the presidency that nobody's covered, and I also try and do something that speaks to our current moment. And in the early 2020s, when I started playing around with this idea about presidents and CEOs, I noticed that CEOs were all over the news, not just in the business pages, but in the political pages as well. And also that both parties, Democrats and Republicans, seem to be increasingly critical of them. So I looked to see if anybody had ever done a study of the relationships between presidents and CEOs before, and I noticed nobody had. So I dove in and I wrote this analysis of what it's like when presidents and CEOs clash, when they collaborate. And I did not know at the time that Elon Musk would be the head of Doge and really involved in the Trump administration. I didn't know there'd be a second Trump administration. But as you were right, I was somewhat clairvoyant. I got lucky in picking presidents and CEOs as my topic a couple of years ago.
Well, speaking of Elon Musk, I don't think I've ever seen anybody involved in government like Elon Musk at the level that Elon Musk has been injected into the political process. Do you like it? Do you think it's positive, or does it give you pause?
It's a really good question because there's one commentator I listen to who says, whenever Trump does something, if you like it, think about, would you like it if the other side did that? And I can imagine being uncomfortable if, let's say, some big labor leader took over massive parts of an administration in a Democratic team and started imposing all kinds of pro-labor regulations that prevented business from doing, from being successful and from making profits in a Democratic administration. So I do try and look at it from that perspective. That said, I'm a big fan of finding and cutting and rooting out government waste. When I worked in the Bush administration, I saw some of these contracts that went to left-wing organizations that I thought should not be going to them, and I was told there's nothing we can do about it. People would just shrug. And the fact that they're actually looking at these contracts and saying, maybe we shouldn't be subsidizing left-wing organizations with tax dollars, I think is a good thing.
Well, so why would the Bush administration have given money to left-wing organizations? How could that happen?
It's not that the Bush administration was giving money to left-wing organizations. It's that there are these multi-year contracts that started long before the Bush administration that just continue administration after administration. And when politicals come and say, hey, can we look at this? They're told, oh, this is just the way it's done. And the Bush administration was less willing to upset apple carts than the Trump administration, and that's why these things continue.
Well, for my money, it's long overdue, and I'm ecstatic that someone is putting a magnifying glass on the federal government, which I believe and frequently say on this program, this federal government is rotten to its core. And I think the amount of corruption and bad deeds that are done with inside the government are horrendous, and it needs to stop, which is not, I hasten to add, an indictment of everybody that works for the federal government. I've worked in a large law firm. I've worked for a public Fortune 500 company. I've worked in my own business. I've also been involved in political campaigns. In every single endeavor I've ever worked in, there have been bad apples. So I don't think the federal government can be immune from that. And I think that's what we're seeing. And in most of those instances, it's the bad apples that seem to get all the attention. And so I think we've got to keep it in proportion, but still, I think this federal government has gotten completely out of control. You've been there. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with everything you say, and there's a couple of specific things to point to. First of all, the reason that you've got all these left-wing groups is because conservatives don't go in there and look to fund right-wing groups with government money, because they're not looking for government money to fund things. They think things should be done through the private sector. So that's one reason why there's a disconnect. The second thing is that in government, there's no incentives to cut out excess spend, incentives to root out waste because there's no bottom line. If you work for a Fortune 500 company that is $37 trillion in debt, that company would be bankrupt. And the shareholders would be out money and the heads of the business would be fired. That doesn't happen in government because there's no way it can ever go bankrupt or in a normal way. And so these things are allowed to continue and fester as just the normal way of doing business. So I think those are the reasons why it's different. And I totally agree with you that we need to take a magnifying glass and try and root it out.
Well, not only the money aspects that and the money that's being wasted and the corruption that we suspect is present, but I'm talking about also the whittling away of our civil liberties, the pressure that's on free speech, people's desire to constrain the Second Amendment, the use or the abuse of FISA warrants, and the spying on a political campaign by the director of the FBI. These things seem to be egregious to me. And the disappointing thing is that it's no secret. It's done right in plain view. And disappointingly, there are seemingly no consequences. Now, Comey lost his job. He got fired. It was done without ceremony. He learned of his firing on CNN while he was in Los Angeles, and they were going to make him fly home commercially, and somebody at the FBI sent the plane to rescue him. But still, he's still writing books and on the speaker's tour. I mean, how can that be?
Well, I'm not a Comey fan. I worked with him in the Bush administration. I always thought he was a guy who just ran for the cameras. But he's allowed to have a have a life after government. I'm glad he's not in government anymore. But I think one of the things you're talking about here is that so much of this stuff is just endemic to government. So these grants that go to left-wing organizations, it's not corruption. I don't like it. It's not corruption. It's just they assume that this is the way it's done. And in some ways, that's even more dangerous. So I think we need to say we're not funding ideological groups. If you want to have a USAID that provides food and medicine to people in poorer countries as a way to help those people and also make the U.S. look good, fine. But why should you have these ideological crusades, transgender comic book, DEI plays and all this stuff? Why should you have that paid for with taxpayer dollars?
Well, when I say corruption, I'm talking about people that are on the Social Security rolls that are 350 years old, legions of people that are 150 years old. What I don't know is whether those people are actually receiving benefits. I've heard both beliefs, and we need to know. I mean, it seems like it would be pretty easy to find out if people are over the age of 150, have checks actually gone out, and have they been cashed? I can't imagine that would take more than a good half an hour to determine. That's the kind of corruption that I'm talking about. And then also I'm told that there are contracts that are put in place and they are just set up for payments in ad infinitum, and that the bureaucrat who puts them in place then leaves government, and God only knows whether they're getting any money after government life or not. But I think there's enough smoke that it certainly warrants a close examination, and I think it should be exposed, and people should be punished if they knowingly have taken government money that they did not earn.
Right. All I'm saying is that there's corruption, which is straight up corruption, which is graft or someone's being bribed, and there's a lot of that and too much of it. But so much of this stuff is not technically illegal corruption. It's just the way the government does business, and that also needs to be clamped down on. So I have problems with both of it. And I think we do need to take a hard look at our finances. Look, we're $37 trillion in debt. I know closing USAID is not going to stop that. But you can't say, oh, I'm not going to solve the problem because no one piece of it will solve the overall problem. You have to start somewhere. And I think the most egregious misuses of taxpayer dollars are probably the place to start.
Can you imagine Democrats standing up against Elon Musk and the work that he is doing? I mean, who would not want to stop, forget corruption, how about just waste and abuse? I mean, if we can label it at that, who would not want to stop that? And I'm sorry if there are people...
Democrats.
But why? I mean,
it's amazing
what intellectual argument can you make to defend that?
Yeah, no, the abuse that Elon Musk undergoes is really astounding. I mean, these people who will allow any illegal immigrant into the country and say you can't actually deport them even if they're criminals, suddenly they say this guy is this immigrant you want to deport. So they go after him even though he's a legal immigrant. And the death threats he gets, and it's really insane. And you just wonder why he would want to do this even. Now I understand he thinks there's an opportunity to fix the country, and that's great, and I appreciate the service, but the abuse you take if you ever actually take on some of these sacred cows is really instructive and is a warning to anybody else who dares to try it.
Well, I was found it particularly chilling that when Elon Musk went on Joe Rogan and he said that he can't push too hard against corruption or else he fears that he would be assassinated. Were you aware of that comment?
I listened to the interview. It was fascinating. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there.
Yeah.
And 10 years ago, Elon Musk and Joe Rogan probably would have been voting Democrat. And I think they're seeing the extent of the problems that we're facing, and they've been willing to change course.
So you really have had a good career in government. You worked for John Ashcroft for 2 years as his domestic policy advisor. You worked for Christopher Cox as director for House Policy Committee. You served in the Bush White House as the Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, inside the Beltway. What's your 30,000-foot view where the people there are working for the good of the American people versus the people there that are working for the good of themselves? And I mean in a bad way.
It's not that many people who are working there for themselves, meaning they're just trying to get rich off their government salaries. I think they have ideological agendas in many cases that they're trying to advance. There are other people who they just care about the prerogatives of their agency, but the agency has skewed priorities. And then there are people who are, just doing the job. And so it's a mix of people. You can't really classify everyone as one thing. But the truth is, when you add it all together, you have a federal government that's spending way too much money, is, I think, insufficiently protective of civil liberties, and is destined to become bankrupt unless we really change course.
So the senator from New Jersey, was it Menendez? Is that right?
Yeah, the gold bar guy.
Yeah. Is he the exception, or do you think that there are other people that are on the take?
There are definitely some people on the take. I wouldn't say it's the majority or even a large percentage of the 2 million federal employees, but of those 2 million career federal employees, a lot of them are just willing to go along, get along, continue to have all this money spent. They don't really look beyond. I mean, you hear these instances, and I know these to be true because I've seen them close up, where let's say there is a contract that the agency doesn't need, but they make sure that they spend that money, because if they give it back, if they say we don't need it, then they're not going to get that appropriation next year. And that's not corruption in the sense of, oh, I'm taking a bribe, but it is a form of corruption in terms of we're taking taxpayer money that we don't need because we want to make sure we keep getting the taxpayer money next time around.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like you. I don't know that I would label that corrupt. I think I would label it somewhere between inept and just incredibly uncaring about protecting the taxpayer dollar. And I don't think that's necessarily a crime, but I don't think that those people should be promoted or even allowed to stay in government once you identify who they are, which I think is what Musk is trying to do. But really, they're alleging that there's a significant number of people that are on the government payroll who don't come to work and are not working and actually have a second job and are getting two paychecks while claiming to be working for the federal government. Is that an epidemic?
Well, that's actually illegal. Right.
Yeah.
That absolutely needs to stop. That's illegal.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, there's a lot of problems with the federal government, and it's one of the reasons we're 37 trillion in debt. And it's not an easy problem to solve, but you really do have to start somewhere. That's why I admire what Doge is doing. I think you have to go after entitlements at some point. That doesn't mean you kick everybody off Social Security or Medicare. I think these are important programs that have value, but can you over time increase the retirement age? Yeah, I think it's something we should consider, because when Lyndon Johnson passed these programs in 1965, Medicare and Medicaid specifically, the retirement age was about the same as life expectancy, 65. And now life expectancy is way higher than that. And if you actually live to 65, your life expectancy is probably into the high 80s. So we're supporting people with these programs in terms of Social Security and Medicare for many more years than we originally anticipated doing.
But hasn't the government borrowed money from Social Security that it should not have? And if it had been left as a true trust fund, would it have been self-sustaining or not?
So government borrowing money from Social Security has definitely reduced the lifespan of the Social Security Trust Fund. That said, we have so many more people who are going to be taking in, who are taking money from it than giving in, that it's an issue regardless of that borrowing, which again is a problem. But the bigger problem is that people are living way longer than we anticipated when we started these programs.
I guess the thing that puzzles me is that you've got these people, 400 plus members of Congress, and they continue, as you point out, to keep voting for more spending and more spending and more spending. Now we've got a $37 million debt, and it's not sustainable. The interest payments on that money is going to be the largest single line item in the federal budget in another couple of years, second largest now. It's not sustainable. I mean, are these people just completely clueless about debits and credits, and then when the house of cards is going to implode, yet they continue to do the same things over and over? I just don't get it. I mean, when are the adults going to show up?
Yeah, I think it gets back to the thing I said about incentives. Nobody in the federal government has incentive to limit spending because it's not their money. These congressmen, their incentive is to get reelected. And you're not going to get reelected if you vote against a spending package, because there's always something in a spending package that somebody can weaponize against you and say, oh, he voted against this. Now, maybe this congressman was overall trying to reduce spending, get us more in line with our revenues and our expenses, like every American family does around their kitchen table. But the congressman knows that he or she will be criticized for cutting benefits to Social Security or cutting defense spending, because they put together these huge spending packages that include everything. And so there's a lot of bad spending in there, but there's some good spending in there. And you know that it's an ugly ad against you if you vote against the so-called good spending.
So, we hear a lot about permanent Washington and the deep state. I think there is a difference. Just how much influence does the deep state have, and how would you identify it?
So there is a difference between permanent Washington and the deep state, as you would say. Permanent Washington just kind of runs on inertia. We spend money, we continue to spend money, and that's the way it goes, and they have no interest in stopping that. Deep state, I think, is people who are actively trying to promote an ideological agenda from what are supposed to be career jobs within the federal government. And I think that's a different thing. They both have their own problems, but that would be my distinction. That's how I define each one.
To me, the deep state may be a little more sinister than that. It is my considered belief that the CIA killed John Kennedy, and they've thus far, 60 years later, continued to get away with it. I would be hard pressed for anyone to convince me that Butler, Pennsylvania was not an inside job. And I worry about the abuse of FISA warrants and wiretapping the campaign of a political opponent. To me, that's deep state. And did you see it up close? Did you have any contact with people that you would have considered to be in the deep state? And were they bad guys?
Well, it's kind of funny. I mean, I thought my description of the deep state was pretty sinister, and you said yours is more sinister. And you're right, yours is more sinister than the way I described it. But it's the same thing.
Well, I happen to believe it is true, though.
Government,
I'm not making it up.
Agenda. I didn't.
I'm sorry.
Right. No, I just thought I was pretty, I thought I was pretty cynical, and you laughed me, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well,
look, I never saw anybody close up who I said, wow, this person is an evil person. I could tell they're evil. But as I said, I did work with Jim Comey, and I wasn't a big fan. So you see only so much of a person in their external guise. There's all sorts of stuff, wheels turning going on the inside that you don't necessarily know about.
Well, what about people like Clapper and Brennan, and I can't remember the other guy. His name escapes me.
They were Democratic political appointees. I never met them.
Yeah, And they
But
signed
I
a
will say,
letter.
I'll say a nice thing about Dick Cheney. Yeah. Dick Cheney saw through Comey. There's a great story that I have in my book, Fight House, where Comey and Cheney are standing next to each other in a cabinet meeting waiting for President Bush to arrive. And Cheney is looking straight ahead, and Comey's trying to talk to Cheney and says, Mr. Vice President, I'm Jim Comey. I'm the Deputy Attorney General. Nice to meet you, all this stuff. And Cheney, without ever looking at him, says, I know who you are. I've seen you on TV, which is making fun of what a TV hawk Comey was, how he always wanted to be on TV, get in front of the cameras.
Yeah. Well, I think it's
Good for
distressing to me
Cheney.
that the 52 intelligence officers of national prominence would sign a letter saying that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. I mean, where do these people get off? How can they continue to operate outside the bounds of the law and our Constitution?
The other crazy thing about that letter is that it was sort of self-perpetuating. They said, "What's the source for it?" The source was the people who signed the letter. So, they had no additional evidence for it. They just signed it based on their own, knowledge or intuition or their own sense of things. But their own sense was intensely partisan.
Well, I think they very clearly impacted the outcome of the 2020 election. I think there was a lot wrong with the 2020 election, but there's no question that if the American people had known that the Hunter Biden laptop was at that time, if they had known it was real, and if they had known the contents of the laptop, I think there's a serious question of whether Biden would have been elected. And Biden himself lied about it. In the debate, he told Trump that it had been debunked and that was Russian disinformation. I mean, the nerve of these people. They're just flagrantly lying in front of us and to our face. That's disturbing to me. It really does offend my sensibilities.
Well, I start my day by reading the New York Post because I feel like I'm going to get the straight scoop, and they are the ones who accurately reported the Hunter Biden story, and the social media companies tried to suppress them and kick them off Twitter for doing so. So let's give kudos to the New York Post.
Absolutely. And so, we've seen the a wave of suppression of people's freedom of speech. Big tech working conjunctively with the FBI in censoring people and canceling them if they did not fall in line with the COVID narrative, if they said anything negative about the vaccines. What was going on? I mean, why would people inside our government want to maintain a false narrative about a serious virus that claimed millions of Americans' lives? What's the end game? That's the piece I've never been able to figure out.
Yeah, so I think there are some people at the top of it who may have had nefarious ends, and others who just went along with it. I think there's a much larger group of people who just went along with it. But from the very beginning, I felt like the people at HHS, and I am somewhat expert in this. I was a deputy secretary at HHS, and I wrote a book about presidents and disasters. I even in 2016 wrote that we don't have any countermeasures for coronavirus in our strategic national stockpile. So I've been looking at this issue for a long time. And look, they were misleading us intentionally for various ends. So one was early on, they said, don't wear masks. And they knew that it would have been fine if people wore masks if they wanted to, but they wanted to hoard or save the masks for the frontline workers. Well, just tell people that. Just be honest and say, well, we think there's a benefit to wearing a mask potentially, but we'd like it if you limited the amount you purchased so that the frontline workers can get it. But they didn't do that. They instead lied and said masks don't have any value. And then they turned completely around and said you had to wear a mask at all times, even if you're outdoors and 50 feet away from somebody. So I think not telling the truth is one of the biggest mistakes you can make in government, because trust is a very valuable commodity. And if you lose that, then you can't get the American people to do things that you actually might need them to do, whether it's shelter in place or take a vaccine or take a certain drug. So I think you've got to deal with the trust of the American people very carefully. It's a very important thing to own.
I think that is incredibly well said, and I certainly agree with you, because who knows what the next virus is going to be, or the next pandemic that we haven't even envisioned or heard of yet. And are the American people going to take protective measures that the government says that they should take when we know that we were lied to with the coronavirus? And not only in your example were we told that masks were good, and then that we were told that masks were not good, And then we were told that masks were essential and you had to wear a mask to go out in public. And now we've learned that the person who told us that published memos to his staff saying that there was no evidence to support, no scientific evidence to support that masks would stop the spread of COVID. So it was a low point in our nation's history. The thing that bothers me the most is that the people are not held accountable. What's the consequence? Fauci, until Trump became president, was still driving around with a security detail and a chauffeur-driven limousine, and I think $350,000 a year pension salary. I mean, it seems to me that he should have been punished for lying to the American people.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this punish point. I'm just not sure on what the punishment is, right? I mean, lying to the American people is itself not a crime. It's a bad thing, but it's not a crime. So I don't know what the mechanism for punishment of somebody who does that is.
Well, I quibble
Maybe
with you about whether it's a
right
bad,
now, I don't think that is.
whether it should be punished or not. I mean, you put somebody in a position of trust, they're the highest paid federal employee, and they're knowingly lying to the American people. There should be a consequence. I can start with the idea of firing them and taking away their pension. Let them go back to work. If they think they're such a genius, let them find a job in the private sector. He's not an old guy. I mean, he's no spring chicken. But I mean, I don't think that we have an obligation to give him a driver and a security detail.
Right, and I think that is the consequence, that you either, if you're a congressman, you can get voted out, or president, you can get voted out.
Yeah.
And if you're an employee, certainly a political appointee, you can be fired. One of the things that's interesting about this whole Doge thing is it's very hard to fire career employees. They have civil service protections. They're the hardest ones on which to impose any consequences.
Well, I think that if they're not answering emails and we can't even demonstrate that they're coming to work, that would be a good grounds for dismissal. But I understand that there's a process and that we'd have to go through the process, and it's there for a purpose. And I think it's probably a legitimate safeguard that we put on civil servants to protect them from political retaliations. So we just lived through 4 years of Biden, and you're a presidential historian. How would you rate him as a president and his effectiveness?
I would say he was poor, and poor in three different ways. Number one, he was manifestly too old for the job, and they were, you want to talk about not being honest. They were not honest with the American people about how they did it. The second thing was, I personally don't like his policy programs, jamming a lot of spending programs down our throats, something like $7 trillion in a 4-year period. And it was a period where we weren't necessarily at war, or there wasn't some national emergency that would have justified all that spending. But the third thing, and I think the most egregious and the most different from what he promised, is he always claimed to be some kind of moderate. He had friends on both sides of the aisle. He was kind of down the middle guy. And his rhetoric as president, I think, was incredibly divisive when he called the people who disagreed with him on voting rights. He called them Jim Crow or Jefferson Davis. He would always call people as MAGA Republicans and try and make them less or other Americans. So I think his rhetoric was really problematic. So poor from the misleading on the age, bad in terms of policies, and I think particularly egregious in not being the moderate that he pretended to be when he was elected.
Well, I agree with everything that you've said. I would add to the list that he was incredibly corrupt. Jamie Comer said that they had proof positive of $30 million in payments that the Biden family received, not from our allies, but from our adversaries, including Russia and China. And I just don't understand why the issue is his age and his mental acuity. Those are relevant, but to me, the much more significant issue was that he's a thief. And I think that he probably was treasonous. I mean, we saw the spy balloon leave China. We've tracked it all the way across the Pacific. We watched it enter Canada and then swoop down and hover over our nuclear bases in the Midwest, where it lingered for days and took 5 days to traverse the country. And then when it got over South Carolina, we courageously shot it down over the Atlantic. Come on. Give me a break.
I don't know what was going on with that one.
Well,
that was a crazy situation.
I think he was bought and paid for. That's what was going on with it. I mean, I don't have.
Biden.
If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And we know that they took $3 million from a China company that was directly tied to the CCP. I mean, doesn't that warrant a very close examination?
Yeah, the Hunter Biden thing is interesting. I don't know if you've seen that recently that Hunter Biden is claiming that he's bankrupt and he's out of funds. Where's all the $30 million that that came to the Biden family? If the guy's so broken, I guess you heard that people aren't buying his artwork anymore. I wonder why. While his dad was president, he sold a lot of art. Now he's not selling it anymore.
Well, and I think we knew why they bought it, and I don't think it was for the aesthetic.
Yeah.
Well, Tevi Troy, thank you for coming on The Truth. We've had a good conversation, and certainly a pleasure to have you on and to be able to tap into your decades-long years of service and inside Washington look behind the curtain. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.